The chains around his wrists had rubbed the skin raw, but Standing Wolf refused to show weakness before his enemies. Blood trickled from the iron shackles as he stood in the center of Fort Harrison's dusty courtyard, surrounded by soldiers and settlers who looked at him with a mixture of fear, hatred, and morbid curiosity. He was, according to the wanted posters plastered throughout Colorado Territory, the most dangerous Lakota war chief alive, the man responsible for countless raids, stolen cattle, and the deaths of 3 cavalry patrols, the savage who had terrorized frontier settlements for 2 years running. But Caitlin Murphy saw something else entirely when she looked into his dark eyes. Standing in the crowd of onlookers, her hands clutching the leather satchel that contained her translation materials, Caitlin felt her breath catch as the prisoner's gaze swept past her. There was no madness there, no bloodthirst that the soldiers spoke of in hushed, fearful tones. Instead, she saw intelligence, dignity, and something that made her heart race with recognition. The quiet desperation of a man who knew he was about to die for crimes he didn't commit. But here's what neither the fort commander nor the bloodthirsty crowd gathering to witness the spectacle knew. Caitlin Murphy was the only person in 300 miles who could speak fluent Lakota. And in less than 24 hours, she would uncover a conspiracy so massive it could ignite a war that would consume half the American frontier. The irony was crushing. Standing Wolf had been brought here as a symbol of savage violence, a trophy to prove that the U.S. Army could protect its citizens from Indian raids. His public execution was meant to send a message to every tribe in the territory. This is what happens to those who dare resist the march of civilization. What the authorities didn't know was that Standing Wolf had spent the last 2 years trying to prevent exactly the kind of bloodshed they accused him of causing. He'd been working secretly with sympathetic military officers to negotiate peace treaties, to find ways for his people to survive the encroachment of white settlers without resorting to violence. And the real war chief responsible for the raids that had brought terror to the frontier? He was standing among the crowd of soldiers watching the proceedings, his uniform clean and his conscience buried beneath years of calculated brutality and perfectly forged reports. As Caitlin watched the chains being tested by a burly sergeant who seemed to take pleasure in Standing Wolf's pain, she felt something shift inside her chest. She'd come to Fort Harrison as a translator for the territorial government, tasked with facilitating communications between military officials and tribal representatives. It was supposed to be routine work, helping to prevent misunderstandings that could lead to conflict. She'd never expected to find herself face-to-face with a man whose execution could destroy any hope of peace in the territory. And she certainly hadn't expected to feel her heart break at the sight of dignity being slowly crushed by injustice. But as Standing Wolf lifted his head and looked directly at her across the dusty courtyard, Caitlin Murphy realized that sometimes fate puts you exactly where you need to be, even when it's the last place you want to be. Tomorrow, she would have to choose between following orders and following her conscience, between keeping her safe government position and risking everything to save a man who might be the key to preventing a war that would cost thousands of lives. The chains around Standing Wolf's wrists weren't the only bonds that would be tested in the days to come. And the woman who thought she was just a translator was about to discover she had the power to change the course of history if she was brave enough to use it. The guard tower's shadow fell across the fort's makeshift prison like a dark omen as Caitlin Murphy approached the wooden stockade where Standing Wolf was being held. Her heart hammered against her ribs with each step, the official documents in her leather satchel feeling heavier than lead. Colonel Marcus Whitfield had been clear in his instructions. Get him to confess to the raids on the Morrison and Fletcher settlements. We need confirmation before the execution tomorrow. His pale blue eyes had glittered with something that made Caitlin's skin crawl. Not justice, but anticipation, as if he was looking forward to watching a man die. Miss Murphy, the young private guarding the stockade, snapped to attention as she approached. Colonel said you'd be coming. The prisoner, well, ma'am, he ain't said a word since they brought him in 3 days ago. Not to nobody. Caitlin nodded, studying the crude wooden structure that served as Standing Wolf's cell. Through the gaps in the logs, she could see him sitting motionless on the dirt floor, his back straight despite the heavy chains that bound his wrists and ankles. Even in captivity, He carried himself with the bearing of a leader. "I'll need privacy for the interrogation, Private." "Henderson, ma'am. And I don't know if that's such a good idea. This one's dangerous. Killed 3 soldiers with his bare hands during the capture, they say." Caitlin turned to study the young soldier's face, noting the fear and excitement warring in his expression. "Were you there during the capture, Private Henderson?" "No, ma'am. But Sergeant Collins was," and he said, "Then you're repeating second-hand information," Caitlin interrupted gently but firmly. "I appreciate your concern, but my job requires me to establish communication with the prisoner. I can't do that effectively with an audience." Henderson hesitated, clearly torn between following orders and protecting what he saw as a defenseless woman from a dangerous savage. Finally, military discipline won out. "Yes, ma'am. I'll be right outside if you need anything. Just holler." The heavy wooden door creaked open, and Caitlin stepped into the dim interior of the cell. The smell hit her immediately: blood, sweat, and the metallic tang of iron from the chains. But underneath it all was something else: the scent of sage and wind-dried grass that spoke of open plains and freedom. Standing Wolf didn't look up when she entered. He remained motionless, his dark hair falling forward to partially obscure his face. Up close, Caitlin could see the extent of his injuries. Not just the raw wounds from the shackles, but older cuts and bruises that suggested his capture had been anything but gentle. "My name is Caitlin Murphy," she said in English, setting her satchel down and pulling out a small wooden chair. "I'm here to translate for the military tribunal." No response. Standing Wolf might as well have been carved from stone. Caitlin sat down, studying his profile. There was something about the set of his shoulders, the way he held his head, that spoke of dignity maintained despite circumstances that would break most men. She'd seen plenty of prisoners during her 3 years working for the territorial government, but none who carried themselves like this. "I know you can understand English," she continued, switching to carefully pronounced Lakota, "but perhaps you prefer to speak in your own tongue." The change was immediate. Standing Wolf's head snapped up, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the imprisoned war chief and the government translator who held his life in her hands. "You speak the language of my people," he said finally, his voice rough from days of silence, but carrying an undertone of surprise. "This is unexpected. I learned from my childhood friend, a Lakota girl named Singing Bird. We grew up together before." Caitlin paused, unsure how much to reveal. "Before the conflict separated our communities." Something shifted in Standing Wolf's expression. "Singing Bird, daughter of many horses?" Caitlin felt her heart skip. "You knew her?" "She married my cousin 2 summers ago. She speaks often of the white girl who learned our ways, who saw past the color of her skin to the person beneath." Standing Wolf's gaze sharpened. "She called you sister who walks between worlds." The childhood name hit Caitlin like a physical blow, bringing with it a flood of memories. Summer days spent learning to weave baskets and identify medicinal plants. Nights listening to stories around the fire. The painful goodbye when tensions between the communities made such friendships impossible. "Is she—" Caitlin began, then stopped herself. This wasn't why she was here. She is well. Her son has seen 2 winters now. Standing Wolf leaned forward slightly, the chains around his wrist clinking softly. "But you did not come here to speak of old friendships, sister who walks between worlds. You came because the Bluecoats want words from me that will justify their thirst for blood." Caitlin felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I came because it's my job to facilitate communication. The colonel wants to understand what happened at the Morrison and Fletcher settlements." "Understand?" Standing Wolf's laugh was bitter. "Or confirm what he has already decided is true." "The evidence—" "What evidence?" Standing Wolf's voice rose slightly, though he kept it low enough that the guard outside wouldn't hear. "Horse tracks that could belong to any warrior? Arrows that could be made by any craftsman? The word of settlers who saw only shadows in the night?" Caitlin pulled out her official notepad, trying to maintain professional distance, even as doubt began to creep into her thoughts. "The survivors identified you specifically. They said the war chief, who led the raids, wore a distinctive headdress with eagle feathers and bear claws. Standing Wolf was quiet for a moment, then slowly reached up and touched his bare head. Do you see such a headdress, sister who walks between worlds? Do you see the marks of a war chief who leads raids? For the first time, Caitlin really looked at him, not as the dangerous prisoner she'd been told he was, but as the man sitting chained before her. His clothes were simple buckskin, well made but without ornamentation. No war paint, no ceremonial jewelry, no symbols of rank or achievement that would mark him as a leader. Perhaps it was removed when you were captured, she said, though the words felt weak even to her. By whom? The soldiers who brought me here unconscious and bleeding? Standing, Wolf leaned back against the wooden wall. Ask yourself this, sister who walks between worlds. If I am the war chief they claim, where are my warriors? Why did no one ride to my aid when I was taken? Why do I sit here alone while my supposed war band continues to terrorize the territory? The questions hit Caitlin like arrows, each one finding a target she hadn't realized was there. In all her preparation for this interview, she'd focused on getting Standing Wolf to confess, not on examining whether the confession would actually make sense. You're saying you're innocent? She said slowly. I'm saying that the man responsible for those raids is still free, still planning, still killing. And tomorrow when they hang me in the center of this fort, he will smile and know that he has succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Who? Caitlin whispered. If not you, then who? Standing Wolf was quiet for so long that Caitlin wondered if he would answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the sound of wind through the stockade walls. A man who wears two faces, sister who walks between worlds. One that your people trust, another that brings death in the darkness. A man who has learned that the best way to win a war is to make sure it never ends. Before Caitlin could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both freeze. The cell door opened with a creak and Colonel Whitfield stepped inside, his pale eyes moving between Caitlin and the prisoner with calculating interest. Miss Murphy, I trust your interview is proceeding productively? The colonel's tone was pleasant, but there was something underneath it that made Caitlin's skin prickle with unease. We've only just begun, Colonel. The prisoner is cooperative, but these things take time. Of course. However, I wanted to inform you that we've moved the execution up to dawn tomorrow. New orders from Territorial Command. Whitfield's smile never reached his eyes. I'm sure you understand the importance of completing your work tonight? Caitlin felt her blood turn to ice. Dawn tomorrow. That gave her less than 18 hours to either extract a confession or what? Even if she believed Standing Wolf's claims of innocence, what could she possibly do about it? I understand, Colonel. Excellent. Sergeant Collins will escort you back to your quarters when you're finished. The prisoner should not be left unguarded for extended periods. Whitfield turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Miss Murphy, I trust you'll remember that your primary loyalty is to the United States government, not to any personal sympathies you might develop during your work. The warning was subtle but unmistakable. As the colonel's footsteps faded, Caitlin found herself staring into Standing Wolf's eyes, seeing her own fear reflected there. He knows, Standing Wolf said quietly, about Singing Bird, about our connection. He chose you for this task deliberately. But why? Because a woman with ties to my people confessing my guilt will carry more weight than the words of soldiers alone. Your translation will be seen as unbiased, trustworthy. Standing Wolf's expression grew grim. He plans to use you as a weapon, sister who walks between worlds. The question is, will you let him? Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the fort's walls in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, the real war chief was preparing for his next move, secure in the knowledge that by dawn tomorrow, the one man who could expose him would be silenced forever. And Caitlin Murphy faced the most important decision of her life: honor her government contract or trust the word of a man in chains who claimed the power to prevent a war. The clock was ticking and the stakes had never been higher. Sleep proved impossible that night. Caitlin lay on her narrow cot in the officers' quarters. staring at the rough wooden ceiling as Standing Wolf's words echoed in her mind. A man who wears two faces, one that your people trust, another that brings death in the darkness. By the time the first pale light of false dawn crept through her window, she'd made her decision. If Standing Wolf was telling the truth, and every instinct she'd developed during 3 years of government work screamed that he was, then she had less than 4 hours to find evidence that could save an innocent man's life. But more than that, she had to identify the real killer before he struck again. Caitlin dressed quickly in her most official-looking clothes, a severe gray dress and matching jacket that marked her as a government employee rather than a frontier woman. She needed every advantage authority could provide for what she was about to attempt. The fort's records office was located in the basement of the main administrative building, a cramped space that smelled of dust, ink, and slowly molding paper. As the territorial translator, Caitlin had legitimate access to military correspondence, though what she planned to do with that access was anything but legitimate. She lit a kerosene lamp and began pulling files from the shelves, looking for reports from the raids that had supposedly made Standing Wolf the most wanted man in Colorado territory. If there were inconsistencies in the official accounts, discrepancies between witness statements, or gaps in the timeline, she'd find them. The first file made her blood run cold. The Morrison settlement raid dated 3 weeks ago. 17 dead, including women and children. War Chief matching description of Standing Wolf seen leading approximately 30 warriors. Distinctive eagle feather headdress with bear claw ornamentation observed by multiple survivors. But as Caitlin read deeper into the report, details began to jump out at her that made her hands tremble. The raid had taken place on a moonless night, yet witnesses had somehow been able to make out specific details of the war chief's headdress in complete darkness. The attackers had supposedly spoken Lakota during the assault, but the exact phrases quoted in the report were grammatically incorrect, mistakes no native speaker would make. Most damning of all, the report was signed by Sergeant Daniel Collins, the same man who had supposedly captured Standing Wolf single-handedly 3 days later. Caitlin pulled the Fletcher settlement file with growing dread. Same pattern, nighttime raid, impossibly specific visual identification, broken Lakota phrases, and Sergeant Collins arriving just in time to document the aftermath. But this file contained something extra, a detailed sketch of the war chief's headdress, drawn with an artist's precision. Too much precision for a traumatized survivor glimpsed in darkness. "Working late, Miss Murphy?" Caitlin spun around, her heart slamming into her throat. Sergeant Collins stood in the doorway, his broad frame blocking her exit. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders and chest, with sandy hair and pale eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the scattered files on her table. "Sergeant Collins," she managed, fighting to keep her voice steady, "I was just reviewing the case files before completing my translation work with the prisoner." "Thorough of you." Collins stepped into the room, and Caitlin noticed he was wearing full gear, gun belt, knife, even his cavalry saber. Strange equipment for a man supposedly making a casual late-night visit to the records office. "Find anything interesting?" "Just doing my job," Caitlin replied, casually placing her hand over the Fletcher file. "Colonel Whitfield wants a complete confession before the execution." Collins moved closer, and Caitlin caught a scent that made her stomach clench. Sage and sweet grass, the same combination Standing Wolf had carried. But on Collins, it smelled wrong, like a disguise rather than a natural scent. "You know, Miss Murphy, I've been thinking about your conversation with the prisoner yesterday. Must have been quite a talk. You were in there for nearly 2 hours. The language barriers made communication difficult." "Oh, I don't think communication was your problem." Collins leaned against the table, his bulk casting a shadow over the scattered papers. "See, the thing about being a translator is sometimes you hear things that weren't meant for your ears, things that might give you ideas about situations you don't fully understand." Caitlin's mouth went dry. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you are." Collins reached over and picked up one of the files, his eyes scanning the pages with the familiarity of someone who'd read them before. "These reports, for instance. Very detailed, very complete, almost like whoever wrote them was there to see everything firsthand." The admission hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. Collins wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. "It was you," Caitlin whispered. "You led those raids." Collins smiled, and for the first time, Caitlin saw past his mask to the cold intelligence underneath. "Now that's a dangerous accusation, Miss Murphy, the kind that could get a person in serious trouble with military authorities. You framed Standing Wolf. You've been using his name, his reputation, to cover your own crimes." "Crimes?" Collins' laugh was genuinely amused. "Miss Murphy, I've been following direct orders, authorized operations designed to destabilize tribal unity and justify expanded military presence in the territory." Caitlin felt the world tilt around her. Authorized by whom? By men who understand that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, but who also understand that public opinion requires proper justification for the kind of comprehensive solution this territory needs. Collins set the file down and moved even closer. Standing Wolf was perfect for our purposes, a real war chief with actual influence among the tribes. When we hang him tomorrow, it'll break the back of tribal resistance for 100 miles in every direction. But he's innocent of the charges? Innocent? Guilty? What's the difference? He's still an Indian standing in the way of progress. Collins's voice hardened. And frankly, Miss Murphy, so are you. Caitlin backed away from the table, her mind racing. She was trapped in a basement room with a man who'd just confessed to mass murder and who clearly had no intention of letting her leave with that knowledge. "The Colonel," she said desperately, "Colonel Whitfield wouldn't authorize the murder of innocent civilians." Collins tilted his head, studying her with something like pity. "Miss Murphy, who do you think gave me those direct orders?" The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Colonel Whitfield, the man she'd been reporting to, the officer who'd specifically requested her services as a translator. He wasn't just complicit in the frame-up, he was orchestrating it. "Why?" she whispered. "Because a peaceful territory is a poor territory, Miss Murphy. No military contracts, no expansion budgets, no opportunities for advancement or profit. But a territory under constant threat from savage Indians? That's worth millions in federal funding, thousands of jobs, and promotion opportunities that extend all the way to Washington." Collins reached for his sidearm, the movement casual and practiced. "Nothing personal, you understand. You're just in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong information." But as his hand closed around his gun, Caitlin acted on pure instinct. She grabbed the heavy kerosene lamp and hurled it directly at Collins' face. The glass shattered on impact, splashing burning oil across his uniform and filling the small room with flames. Collins screamed, stumbling backward as fire raced up his shirt. Caitlin didn't wait to see the extent of the damage. She grabbed the Fletcher file and ran for the door, Collins' anguished curses echoing behind her. The basement corridor was dark and narrow, filled with smoke from the growing fire in the records office. Caitlin stumbled toward the stairs, clutching the evidence that could save Standing Wolf's life if she could survive long enough to present it. Behind her, Collins was shouting for help, his voice hoarse from smoke and pain. Soon the entire fort would be awake, and she'd be trapped with nowhere to run. But as she reached the top of the stairs, Caitlin realized she had one advantage Collins didn't expect. He couldn't afford to let anyone else examine those files too closely. If the military brass discovered what he'd been doing, it wouldn't just be her life on the line. It would be his, and Colonel Whitfield's, and whoever else was involved in this conspiracy. Which meant she had until dawn to figure out how to save Standing Wolf and expose the truth before Collins and his conspirators found a way to silence her permanently. The fort's bell tower chimed 4 times as Caitlin slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness. 4 hours until the execution. 4 hours to prove that the man in chains was innocent and the man with the badge was the real savage. But first, she had to survive long enough to reach Standing Wolf's cell. Because if Collins was the false war chief who'd been terrorizing the territory, then he'd already proven he had no qualms about killing innocent people. And Caitlin Murphy had just made herself his next target. The game of cat and mouse was about to begin, with an innocent man's life hanging in the balance. Caitlin's hands shook as she gathered the scattered documents from her desk, her mind racing through the desperate plan forming in her thoughts. 2 hours until dawn, 2 hours to gather enough evidence to expose Colonel Whitfield's conspiracy, and save Standing Wolf's life. The first challenge was getting past the guard Collins had undoubtedly stationed outside her quarters. She'd noticed during her escort back that the sergeant had lingered longer than necessary in the hallway, and the soft murmur of voices suggested he'd left someone behind to watch her. Moving as quietly as possible, Caitlin crept to her small window and peered out into the pre-dawn darkness. The fort was laid out in a standard military grid, with the command buildings at the center and the perimeter guard posts marking the outer walls. What she needed was in Whitfield's office, the original patrol reports that would show the patterns she discovered, hopefully with enough detail to prove his involvement to someone in authority. But first, she needed to know who she could trust. Caitlin had spent enough time around military installations to understand the hierarchies and relationships that govern fort life. Colonel Whitfield might be the commanding officer, but every fort had informal power structures built on respect, competence, and personal loyalty. She needed to find someone whose integrity was beyond question and whose authority was sufficient to challenge a colonel's orders. The answer came to her as she remembered a conversation from her first day at the fort. Major Harrison Webb, the post's second in command, had a reputation as an officer who followed regulations to the letter and treated everyone, white or Indian, with strict fairness. More importantly, she'd overheard two sergeants discussing how Webb had questioned some of Whitfield's more aggressive policies regarding tribal relations. If anyone could be trusted with the truth, it would be Webb. Caitlin wrapped her documents in her shawl and moved to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. She could hear the soft shuffle of boots in the hallway. One guard, probably young and bored after hours of watching an empty corridor. Perfect. She waited until the footsteps moved away from her door, then slipped out and headed in the opposite direction. The fort's layout worked in her favor. The officers' quarters were on the far side of the compound from the command buildings, requiring a circuitous route that would take her past several potential hiding places if she needed to avoid detection. The journey across the fort felt like navigating a minefield. Every shadow could hide a sentry, every sound could signal discovery. But Caitlin had spent her childhood playing hide-and-seek with Singing Bird through the forests around their settlements, and those skills served her well as she slipped between buildings and avoided the regular patrol routes. Major Webb's quarters were dark when she reached them, but that was expected at this hour. She'd have to wake him and hope he'd listen to her story before deciding she was either crazy or treasonous. Taking a deep breath, she knocked softly on his door. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. The response was immediate and professional. "Who's there?" "Major Webb, this is Caitlin Murphy, the translator. I have urgent information regarding tomorrow's execution that requires your immediate attention." She heard the sound of movement inside, then the door opened to reveal a tall, lean man in his 40s with graying hair and intelligent brown eyes that assessed her quickly and thoroughly. "Miss Murphy, this is highly irregular. What kind of urgent information?" "The kind that could prevent the execution of an innocent man and expose a conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of this fort's command structure." Caitlin's words came out in a rush, desperation making her voice tight. "Please, Major. Standing Wolf is not the war chief responsible for the raids. I have evidence." Webb's expression remained carefully neutral, but he stepped aside to let her enter his quarters. The room was Spartanly furnished but meticulously organized, the domain of a man who valued order and precision. "You have 5 minutes to explain yourself, Miss Murphy, and this better be more substantial than sympathetic feelings for the condemned man." Caitlin spread her documents on Webb's small table, pointing to the patrol schedules and raid dates she'd cross-referenced. "Look at the timing, Major. Every attack occurred exactly 3 days after a military patrol passed through the area. Every raid targeted settlements that our patrols had recently assessed for defensive capabilities and valuable resources." Webb leaned over the papers, his expression growing more concerned as he studied the patterns. This could be coincidence. The raiding parties might have their own scouts, led by someone with detailed knowledge of our patrol schedules and tactical assessments. Caitlin interrupted. "Someone who knew exactly when each settlement would be most vulnerable?" She pulled out another document. "Look at this. The Morrison raid. According to the official report, the attackers knew exactly where the family kept their money and how many men were capable of fighting, information that wasn't available to any outside observer." Webb's face had gone pale, Where did you get this information? From Colonel Whitfield's own files. Information he gave me to help prepare for Standing Wolf's interrogation. Caitlin met his eyes directly. Major, I believe Colonel Whitfield has been orchestrating these raids himself, using them to justify increasingly harsh policies toward the local tribes. The silence that followed was deafening. Webb straightened slowly, his expression cycling through disbelief, horror, and finally grim acceptance. You're accusing a superior officer of treason, Miss Murphy. The evidence would need to be overwhelming to make such charges stick. It is overwhelming, and there's more. Caitlin took a deep breath, knowing she was about to burn all her bridges. 3 hours ago, Colonel Whitfield confessed to me personally. He admitted to staging the raids and explained that Standing Wolf's execution serves his larger goal of accelerating Indian removal from the territory. Webb stared at her for a long moment. He confessed to you directly? He also threatened me with treason charges if I didn't cooperate with tomorrow's execution. He has fabricated evidence against me, just as he did with Standing Wolf. Caitlin's voice grew stronger. Major, we have less than 2 hours to prevent the execution of an innocent man and expose a conspiracy that has cost dozens of lives. Webb moved to his window, staring out at the fort where his soldiers slept, unaware that their commanding officer was the enemy they'd been sent to fight. Even if everything you're saying is true, challenging Whitfield directly would require evidence that could stand up to a military tribunal. We'd need witnesses, documentation, proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Then we get it. Caitlin stood, her resolve hardening. We break into his office, find the original documents, locate any co-conspirators who might be willing to testify. Miss Murphy, what you're suggesting is the only way to prevent a massive injustice and expose a traitor who's been using his position to commit murder. Caitlin moved closer to Webb. Major, you took an oath to defend the Constitution and protect innocent lives. Standing Wolf is innocent. Are you going to let him die because following proper procedures is more convenient than doing what's right? The challenge hung in the air between them. Webb was clearly a man who respected authority and followed regulations, but he was also someone whose moral compass pointed toward justice regardless of personal cost. Finally, he nodded. What do you need me to do? Relief flooded through Caitlin so powerfully she almost staggered. We need to get into Whitfield's office and find the original patrol reports, the ones that show his personal involvement in planning routes that coincided with raid locations. We also need to identify any other officers who might have been involved. The office will be locked, and Whitfield probably keeps sensitive documents in his personal safe. Then we'll have to find another way. What about Sergeant Collins? He's clearly working with Whitfield. Maybe we can use that against them. Webb was already moving, pulling on his uniform jacket with military efficiency. Collins has been Whitfield's right hand for 2 years. If anyone knows about the colonel's extracurricular activities, it would be him. He paused, looking at Caitlin with newfound respect. You realize that if we're wrong about this, we'll both face courts-martial and likely execution? And if we're right but do nothing, an innocent man dies and a traitor continues to murder people while wearing an American uniform. Caitlin gathered her documents. Major, I'd rather face execution for trying to do the right thing than live knowing I let injustice triumph because I was afraid. Webb smiled, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him. In that case, Miss Murphy, let's go save a life and catch a traitor. As they prepared to leave his quarters, the eastern horizon showed the first faint hint of gray. Dawn was coming faster than either of them had hoped, and Standing Wolf's time was running out. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Caitlin felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. They had a plan, they had evidence, and they had each other. Against a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the fort's command structure, it might not be enough, but it would have to be, because failure meant more than just Standing Wolf's death. It meant allowing a madman to continue using genocide as a tool of policy. The race against dawn had begun in earnest. The command building stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness, its windows black as a tomb. Caitlin crouched behind a supply wagon with Major Webb, both of them studying the building's layout and the patterns of the night sentries. Somewhere inside that structure lay the evidence that could save Standing Wolf's life, if they could reach it before the sun rose and brought with it the sound of hammers building a gallows. There, Webb whispered, pointing to a window on the second floor. Whitfield's office. The window latch has been broken for weeks. He keeps complaining about the draft but won't authorize repairs. How do we get up there without being seen? Webb smiled grimly. 20 years of military service teaches you that every fort has its blind spots. See that drainage pipe? It runs right up the side of the building, hidden from the main patrol routes. Caitlin looked up at the narrow iron pipe, calculating the climb. It had been years since she'd scrambled up trees with Singing Bird, but desperation had a way of reviving forgotten skills. What about guards inside the building? Night Watch focuses on the perimeter and the armory. The command building should be empty except for the duty officer, and he'll be in the front office on the ground floor. Webb checked his pocket watch, the face barely visible in the starlight. We have maybe an hour and a half before the morning shift change. After that, Standing Wolf would be led to the gallows, and their chance to save him would die with the rising sun. They moved across the open ground between buildings like ghosts, using shadows and supply stacks for cover. Caitlin's heart hammered against her ribs as they reached the base of the command building, every nerve straining for sounds of discovery. The drainage pipe was old and corroded, but it held their weight as they climbed. Webb went first, his military training evident in the efficient way he moved up the building's side. Caitlin followed, grateful for the rough iron that provided good handholds despite the rust flakes that showered down with each movement. The broken window latch gave way with barely a whisper of sound. Webb eased the window open and slipped inside, then reached back to help Caitlin through. They found themselves in Whitfield's private office, surrounded by the trappings of military authority that masked the corruption beneath. The safe is behind that map, Webb whispered, pointing to a large territorial chart mounted on the far wall. But first, let's see what we can find in his desk. They worked by the light of a shuttered lantern Webb had brought, careful to keep the beam low and directed away from the windows. Caitlin rifled through desk drawers while Webb examined file cabinets, both searching for anything that might connect Whitfield to the raids. Here, Caitlin breathed, pulling out a folder marked Confidential Tribal Intelligence. Inside were detailed reports on settlement patterns, defensive capabilities, and resource assessments. Exactly the kind of information that had been used to target the raids. But more damning were the handwritten notes in the margins, observations about optimal timing for disruption operations, and acceptable casualty projections. Webb looked over her shoulder, his face grim in the lantern light. This is good, but not enough. Any decent lawyer could argue that this is routine intelligence gathering. We need something more direct. What about the safe? Webb moved to the map and swung it aside on hidden hinges, revealing a steel safe built into the wall. The lock was complex, far beyond anything they could hope to crack without tools and expertise they didn't possess. Damn. Webb stared at the safe, frustration evident in his voice. Whatever's in there is beyond our reach. A soft sound from the hallway made them both freeze. Footsteps, approaching slowly but deliberately. Someone was coming up the stairs to the second floor, and there was nowhere to hide in Whitfield's office that wouldn't be immediately obvious to anyone entering the room. Webb extinguished the lantern, plunging them into darkness. They pressed themselves against the wall beside the door, hearts pounding as the footsteps grew closer. The steps paused outside the office door, and Caitlin could hear the soft jingle of keys. The door opened slowly, and a figure stepped inside carrying a small oil lamp. In the weak light, Caitlin recognized Sergeant Collins, his weathered face alert and suspicious as he scanned the office. Had he seen their light? Heard them moving around? Collins moved toward the desk, and Caitlin realized with horror that they'd left the confidential folder open on the desktop. The moment he saw it, he'd know someone had been searching through Whitfield's papers. Webb stepped out of the shadows with military precision, his service revolver pressed to the base of Collins' skull before the sergeant could react. Don't move, Sergeant. Don't speak. Just listen. Collins went rigid, the oil lamp trembling in his grip, but his soldiers' discipline keeping him motionless. We know about the raids, Webb continued quietly. We know Whitfield has been orchestrating them, and we know you've been helping him. What we don't know is how deep this conspiracy goes. Major Webb? Colin's voice was carefully controlled, but Caitlin could hear the shock beneath the surface. Sir, I don't understand what you're talking about. The Morrison settlement, the Fletcher farm, the Hartwell ranch. Webb's voice was ice-cold professional. Every raid planned using intelligence you helped gather. Every attack timed to coincide with patrol schedules you helped arrange. Caitlin stepped out of the shadows, and Collins's eyes widened as he recognized her. The translator lady? But you're supposed to be locked in my quarters, preparing to help you frame an innocent man? Caitlin moved closer, studying Collins's face in the lamplight. I was, until I discovered that the real war chief responsible for those raids has been wearing a U.S. Army uniform. Collins was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Webb's determined face and Caitlin's accusatory stare. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of suppressed guilt. You don't understand the position I was in. Whitfield had evidence that I'd been selling Army supplies to supplement my pay. My wife was sick, needed medicine I couldn't afford on a sergeant's wages. Collins's shoulders sagged. He said all I had to do was provide information on patrol routes and settlement assessments. He never told me what he planned to use it for. Until people started dying, Webb said grimly. By then it was too late to back out. He said if I tried to expose him, he'd have me court-martialed for theft and treason. My family would have been left with nothing. Collins looked at Caitlin with desperate eyes. I never wanted innocent people to die, but I couldn't see any way out that didn't destroy my family. Caitlin felt a surge of unexpected sympathy for the trapped man. Collins wasn't evil like Whitfield. He was weak, caught in a web of blackmail and threats that had slowly drawn him into complicity with murder. There's still time to make it right, she said gently. Help us stop him, and maybe we can find a way to protect your family. The combination to his safe, Webb added, that's what we need. Whatever evidence he keeps in there will be enough to prove his guilt and save Standing Wolf's life. Collins stared at them both, weighing his options with the desperate calculation of a man who'd been trapped between impossible choices for too long. Finally, he nodded. 8/14/61, the date the war started. Collins' voice was barely a whisper. But Major, you need to understand, Whitfield's not the only one involved. There are others, higher up the chain of command. People who've been profiting from the conflicts he creates. Webb moved to the safe, his fingers working the combination as Collins spoke. Who else? Territorial officials, Indian agents who get paid for every tribe they relocate, supply contractors who make fortunes selling weapons and provisions for extended military campaigns. Collins set down his lamp with trembling hands. This goes all the way to Washington, Major. We're not just exposing one corrupt colonel, we're threatening an entire system. The safe clicked open, revealing stacks of documents, correspondence, and what appeared to be detailed financial records. Webb pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it, his expression growing darker as he read. Payment schedules for special operations, he said grimly. Correspondence with territorial officials discussing accelerated relocation timelines. And, he paused, pulling out a sheet of paper, a detailed plan for staging attacks on 3 more settlements, including specific instructions on making the raids look like the work of Standing Wolf's warriors. Caitlin felt sick as the full scope of Whitfield's conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just about framing one innocent man. It was about systematically murdering settlers to create the public outrage needed to justify genocide. There's more, Webb continued, rifling through the documents. Financial records showing payments to corrupt Indian agents, bribes to territorial newspapers for favorable coverage, even funds allocated for eliminating problematic tribal leaders who advocate for peace. Standing Wolf hadn't just been framed for raids he didn't commit. He'd been targeted for elimination because his peace negotiations threatened Whitfield's profitable war. The sound of voices in the courtyard below made them all freeze. Through the window, Caitlin could see soldiers beginning to gather around what would soon become Standing Wolf's execution site. The sky was definitely lighter now, and she could hear the sound of hammers as the gallows took shape. We need to move, Webb said, gathering the most damning documents. Collins, you're coming with us. Your testimony combined with this evidence should be enough to stop the execution and bring charges against Whitfield. What about the others? The people in Washington? Collins asked. One battle at a time, Sergeant. First, we save Standing Wolf. Then we use what we've learned to expose the rest of them? Webb looked at Caitlin with something approaching admiration. Miss Murphy, I believe you may have just prevented a war. But as they prepared to leave Whitfield's office with their stolen evidence, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows across the courtyard. Colonel Whitfield had risen early to witness his triumph, and he'd seen the light in his office window. The race against dawn had become a race against discovery, and the stakes had just gotten deadly. The corridor leading away from Whitfield's office felt like a tunnel toward Judgment Day. Major Webb led the way, the stolen documents clutched against his chest, while Caitlin and Sergeant Collins followed close behind. The sound of their footsteps seemed impossibly loud in the pre-dawn silence, each creak of floorboard a potential alarm that could bring armed soldiers running. They were halfway to the stairwell when the lights blazed on throughout the command building. "Move!" Webb hissed, breaking into a run as shouts echoed from below. Heavy boots thundered up the stairs and the distinctive voice of Colonel Whitfield cut through the chaos like a blade. "Seal the building! No one gets out! We have intruders in the command center!" Caitlin's heart hammered as they reached the window they'd entered through, but Webb was already shaking his head. Too late. They'll have men positioned outside by now. He pressed the documents into her hands. "Take these. You're the only one they can't afford to shoot on sight." "What do you mean?" "You're a civilian, a woman, and officially under the protection of the territorial government. Killing you would create too many questions." Webb's expression was grim but resolute. "Collins and I are soldiers. We can be quietly court-martialed and executed for treason. But you have a chance." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. They could hear Whitfield's voice directing the search, his tone carrying the cold fury of a man whose carefully laid plans had been disrupted. "There," Webb pointed to a service corridor that led toward the building's rear exit. "That leads to the kitchen area, if you can reach the back door." "I'm not leaving you both to face this alone," Caitlin protested. "You're not leaving us," Collins said quietly, his weathered face showing a peace she hadn't seen before. "You're completing the mission. Those documents are the only thing that can save Standing Wolf now." The footsteps were almost at their floor. Webb grabbed Caitlin's shoulders, his eyes intense. "Listen to me. Take the evidence to Captain Morrison in the territorial office. He's Whitfield's biggest rival for promotion, and he's clean. I'd stake my life on it." He paused, realizing what he'd just said. "I am staking my life on it." Caitlin clutched the documents tighter, understanding finally settling over her like a cold shroud. "You're going to surrender. Draw their attention while I escape." "We're going to buy you time," Webb corrected. "Collins, you ready to face the consequences?" The sergeant nodded, straightening his shoulders with military precision. "Been ready for 2 years, Major. Time to stop being a coward." Before Caitlin could protest further, both men stepped out into the main hallway, their hands raised in surrender. She heard Whitfield's triumphant voice. "Major Webb!" "How disappointing to find you involved in this treachery. And Sergeant Collins, though your participation is less surprising." Caitlin forced herself to move, slipping down the service corridor as the sound of her allies being arrested faded behind her. The documents seemed to burn against her chest, where she'd hidden them beneath her shawl, and she prayed that Webb's faith in Captain Morrison was justified. The rear exit was unguarded. Whitfield's men had focused on sealing the main entrances, assuming any intruders would try to escape the way they'd entered. Caitlin slipped out into the dawn air, the eastern sky now showing definite streaks of gold and crimson. The execution was scheduled for sunrise, which meant she had perhaps 30 minutes to reach Morrison and convince him to act. But as she hurried across the fort's back areas, staying in the shadows of supply buildings and equipment sheds, she realized the true scope of Whitfield's trap. Soldiers were moving with military precision throughout the compound, not searching randomly, but following predetermined patterns that suggested they'd been briefed on exactly this scenario. Whitfield had planned for the possibility of discovery. He'd prepared contingencies for exposing his conspiracy, which meant he probably had contingencies for everything, including neutralizing Captain Morrison if necessary. Caitlin felt despair beginning to creep in as she reached the territorial office, a modest wooden building near the fort's main gate. The windows were dark and the door was locked. Morrison wasn't here yet. She checked her watch. 23 minutes until sunrise. 23 minutes until Standing Wolf died for crimes he didn't commit. The sound of approaching horses made her press herself against the building's side wall. A small group of riders was entering the fort, their arrival causing a stir among the soldiers. As they came closer, Caitlin recognized the lead rider, a distinguished man in his 50s wearing the uniform of a territorial administrator. Captain Morrison had arrived, but he wasn't alone. With him rode 3 other officials, including someone Caitlin recognized from newspaper photographs. Territorial Governor James Bradford, the man whose policies had made the current Indian conflicts possible. Her heart sank as she realized Whitfield's final masterstroke. The colonel hadn't just prepared for the possibility of being exposed, he'd arranged for the territorial government's highest officials to witness Standing Wolf's execution personally. Any evidence she presented now would be dismissed as the desperate lies of a conspiracy theorist trying to prevent a justified execution. But as the group dismounted and prepared to enter the fort proper, Caitlin heard something that changed everything. "I still have concerns about this execution, Morrison," Governor Bradford was saying. "The evidence against this Standing Wolf seems remarkably convenient. 3 separate raids perfectly documented, witnesses who all give identical descriptions, a capture that left no American casualties." "Your concerns are noted, Governor," Captain Morrison replied, his tone carefully neutral. "But Colonel Whitfield has assured us that the case is airtight." "Yes, Colonel Whitfield." Bradford's voice carried a note of skepticism that gave Caitlin hope. "The same Colonel Whitfield who has requested 3 budget increases this year for expanded military operations against tribes that seem to become more hostile every month." Morrison paused in adjusting his horse's reins. "Sir, are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting that some coincidences are too convenient to ignore," Bradford interrupted. "And I'm suggesting that executing a war chief who has never been positively identified by reliable witnesses might be premature." Caitlin felt her pulse quicken. Governor Bradford was already suspicious of Whitfield's activities. If she could reach him with the evidence Webb had died to obtain. But as she stepped out of the shadows, prepared to approach the governor directly, a familiar voice cut through the morning air. "Governor Bradford! What an unexpected pleasure to have you witness this historic moment personally." Colonel Whitfield strode across the fort's courtyard, resplendent in his dress uniform, his pale eyes glittering with confident satisfaction. Behind him marched a squad of soldiers, and between them, in chains and bloodied from what appeared to be a recent beating, were Major Webb and Sergeant Collins. "Colonel," Bradford nodded coolly, "I trust everything is proceeding according to schedule?" "Better than scheduled, actually. We've just uncovered a conspiracy to free the prisoner and falsify evidence in his favor." Whitfield gestured toward Webb and Collins. "These 2 traitors, along with a civilian accomplice who remains at large, broke into my office and attempted to steal classified documents." Caitlin's blood turned to ice. Whitfield was turning their investigation into proof of a conspiracy to protect Standing Wolf. Every piece of evidence they'd gathered would now be dismissed as fabricated materials designed to support their plot to free a guilty man. "Major Webb?" Governor Bradford looked genuinely shocked. "This is highly irregular." "Treason often appears irregular to those not involved in it," Whitfield replied smoothly. "But don't worry, Governor. Justice will be served today, first to the savage who has terrorized our settlements, then to the traitors who tried to protect him." Captain Morrison stepped forward, his expression troubled. "Colonel, what evidence of conspiracy do you have? Major Webb has an exemplary service record." "Had an exemplary record," Whitfield corrected, "until he was corrupted by sympathies for the enemy. We found him in my office with stolen documents and a confession from Sergeant Collins detailing their plan to stage a rescue attempt." Collins raised his bloodied head, his eyes finding Whitfield's across the courtyard. Despite his injuries, his voice carried clearly in the morning air. "The only confession you'll get from me, Colonel, is the truth about what you've been doing, about the settlements you've destroyed and the people you've murdered to advance your career." "The desperate lies of a caught traitor," Whitfield said dismissively. but Caitlin noticed his jaw tighten slightly. Then explain the documents in your safe, Webb added, his words slurred through swollen lips, but still audible. The payment schedules, the correspondence with corrupt officials, the plans for future attacks. Fabricated materials planted by the conspirators, Whitfield interrupted quickly. Governor, surely you can see that these men are trying to create doubt about legitimate evidence through desperate accusations. But Governor Bradford was studying Whitfield's face with the sharp eyes of a politician who'd survived by reading people accurately. Colonel, you seem remarkably prepared with explanations for events that supposedly just occurred, almost as if you'd anticipated this exact scenario. The observation hung in the air like a blade. Whitfield's confident mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. I've learned to anticipate treachery in all its forms, Governor. The frontier teaches harsh lessons about trust. Indeed it does. Bradford turned toward the sound of construction. And what lessons does it teach about justice? I assume the gallows being built are for more than one prisoner now? The execution schedule remains unchanged, Whitfield replied. Standing Wolf dies at sunrise as planned. The traitors will face a proper court-martial after the immediate threat is resolved. Caitlin realized with horrible clarity that Whitfield's plan was still working perfectly. Standing Wolf would die in minutes, taking with him any chance of exposing the truth about the raids. Webb and Collins would face a rigged court-martial and execution, their accusations dismissed as the lies of desperate traitors, and she would be hunted down in silence before she could present the evidence hidden beneath her shawl. But as she watched Governor Bradford's skeptical expression and Captain Morrison's growing unease, she realized that Whitfield had made one crucial error. He'd brought witnesses to his triumph who were already inclined to doubt him. All she needed was the courage to step forward and trust that the truth would be stronger than his lies. The sun was rising, painting the fort's walls in gold and crimson. In the distance, she could see Standing Wolf being led toward the gallows, his dignity intact despite the chains and the approaching death. It was time for Caitlin Murphy, the translator who walked between worlds, to choose which world she would save. The first rays of sunrise painted the fort's gallows in golden light as Standing Wolf was led across the courtyard, his chains clinking with each dignified step. Despite the beating he'd endured, despite the certainty of approaching death, he walked with the bearing of a chief, head high, shoulders straight, refusing to give his enemies the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Caitlin watched from her hiding place behind the supply building, the stolen documents burning against her chest like a brand. Governor Bradford and Captain Morrison stood with the gathered crowd, their expressions troubled, but their positions unclear. Whitfield commanded the scene with theatrical precision, orchestrating what he intended to be his greatest triumph. Citizens of the Colorado Territory, Whitfield's voice carried clearly across the courtyard, today we witness justice served against those who would terrorize innocent settlers and murder American citizens in their beds. The crowd murmured approval, but Caitlin noticed that not everyone seemed convinced. Several soldiers watched the proceedings with uncomfortable expressions, and she recognized doubt in the faces of some civilian observers. This savage, Whitfield continued, gesturing toward Standing Wolf, has confessed through our translator to his crimes against the Morrison and Fletcher families. He will now pay the ultimate price for his bloodthirsty savagery. Caitlin felt her blood turn to ice. Whitfield was lying about a confession she'd never given, using her name to legitimize Standing Wolf's execution. In a few minutes, an innocent man would die based on words she'd never spoken. Standing Wolf was positioned beneath the gallows crossbeam, the noose placed around his neck by a soldier who avoided meeting the condemned man's eyes. The executioner tested the rope's tension with professional efficiency, preparing to send the trap door lever that would end a life and seal a conspiracy. "Have you any final words?" Whitfield asked, though his tone suggested he considered the question mere formality. Standing Wolf's voice carried clearly across the silent courtyard, speaking in heavily accented English that everyone could understand. "I am innocent of the crimes you accuse me of. The real war chief who killed your people stands among you now, wearing the uniform of your army, protected by your trust. The desperate lies of a condemned savage," Whitfield replied dismissively, but Caitlin saw Governor Bradford lean forward with increased interest. If I am the war chief you seek, Standing Wolf continued, his eyes finding Whitfield's across the crowd, then why have no warriors come to rescue me? Why does no war band ride to avenge their leader's capture? Ask yourself why the man who supposedly commands hundreds of warriors dies alone and abandoned. The logic of the question rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown in the still water. Several people exchanged glances, and Caitlin heard whispered conversations beginning among the observers. Because your warriors are cowards, Whitfield snapped, but his voice carried an edge of desperation now. Like all savages, they abandon their leaders when faced with superior American force. No, Standing Wolf replied with quiet dignity, because I am not their war chief. I am a man who has spent 2 years trying to prevent the very bloodshed you have used to justify this execution. Governor Bradford stepped forward, his political instincts clearly engaged. Colonel Whitfield, I'd like to hear more about this confession you mentioned. Where is the translator who obtained it? Whitfield's eyes swept the crowd, searching for Caitlin's face among the observers. When he didn't find her, his expression tightened slightly. Miss Murphy is, preparing the official documentation of the confession for territorial records. Then perhaps we should wait for her to present it before proceeding, Bradford suggested. A confession of this magnitude should be properly witnessed and documented. The confession has already been verified through proper channels, Whitfield replied quickly. Delaying justice serves no one's interests. But Captain Morrison was now studying Whitfield with the sharp attention of a career soldier recognizing deception. Colonel, in my experience, major confessions are always presented publicly before execution. It's standard procedure. Whitfield's mask was beginning to crack under the pressure of questions he hadn't anticipated. Gentlemen, we cannot allow legal technicalities to interfere with... Governor Bradford! Caitlin's voice cut through the morning air like a blade as she stepped out from behind the supply building, the stolen documents clutched in her hands. Every eye in the courtyard turned toward her, including Whitfield's, and she saw the colonel's face go pale with recognition and fury. Miss Murphy, Bradford called out, relief evident in his voice. Perfect timing. We were just discussing your translation of the prisoner's confession. Caitlin walked across the courtyard with steady steps, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. This was the moment that would determine whether justice or conspiracy prevailed, whether an innocent man lived or died, whether the truth could overcome carefully orchestrated lies. Governor Bradford, she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard, I must report that Colonel Whitfield has been lying to you and to everyone here. Standing Wolf never confessed to anything because Standing Wolf is innocent of the charges against him. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs, but Whitfield's reaction was swift and vicious. Arrest that woman! She's part of the conspiracy I warned you about, a traitor working to free a condemned savage. But Governor Bradford raised his hand for silence, his political authority commanding immediate attention. Let her speak. I want to hear what she has to say. Caitlin held up the documents Webb had died to obtain. 3 hours ago, I discovered evidence that Colonel Whitfield has been staging the very raids he claims to be investigating. These documents from his personal safe detail his involvement in orchestrating attacks on innocent settlements to justify expanded military operations and accelerated Indian removal. Lies, Whitfield shouted, but his voice cracked with desperation. Fabricated evidence planted by conspirators. Then explain this, Caitlin said, pulling out a specific document. A payment schedule for special operations that coincides exactly with the dates of the Morrison and Fletcher raids. Explain correspondence with territorial officials discussing acceptable casualty projections for future attacks. Governor Bradford took the documents from her hands, his expression growing darker as he read. Captain Morrison looked over his shoulder, and Caitlin saw the moment when understanding dawned in the captain's eyes. These are written on official territorial letterhead, Bradford said slowly, with signatures I recognize. He looked up at Whitfield with the cold fury of a politician who'd been used as an unwitting accomplice to murder. Colonel, you have considerable explaining to do. That woman is a known Indian sympathizer who has fabricated evidence to protect her savage lover. Whitfield's composure had completely shattered now, revealing the desperate cruelty beneath his civilized mask. But Standing Wolf's voice cut through the accusations with quiet dignity. Sister who walks between worlds speaks truth, not from love, but from justice. She risked her life to expose the man who has murdered your people while wearing your uniform. The childhood name sparked recognition among some of the older soldiers, men who remembered when relations between settlers and tribes had been based on mutual respect rather than systematic deception. Several nodded appreciatively at Standing Wolf's use of the honorific title. Governor Bradford continued reading the documents, his expression growing grimmer with each page. Colonel Whitfield, these documents detail a conspiracy that extends far beyond simple raid staging. This is systematic genocide disguised as law enforcement. Lies and fabrications, Whitfield screamed, but his desperation was now obvious to everyone watching. Then why, Captain Morrison asked quietly, are Major Webb and Sergeant Collins standing there beaten and bloodied? What did they discover that warranted such treatment? All eyes turned to the two soldiers, still bound but unbowed. Webb straightened as much as his injuries allowed. We discovered that Colonel Whitfield has been the war chief terrorizing this territory for 2 years, using his position to orchestrate attacks that justify his requests for expanded military authority and increased budgets. Collins here can testify to being blackmailed into providing intelligence that made the raids possible. Webb continued, his voice growing stronger. Every attack was planned using military reconnaissance in time to maximize casualties while minimizing the chance of military intervention. Sergeant Collins nodded, blood still trickling from his split lip. I've got records hidden in my quarters, Governor. Names, dates, payment schedules. Everything needed to prove that Colonel Whitfield has been profiting from the murders he's committed. The weight of evidence and testimony was overwhelming. Governor Bradford looked around the courtyard, seeing the shocked faces of soldiers and civilians who trusted Whitfield's authority, then turned back to the colonel with implacable resolve. Colonel Marcus Whitfield, you are under arrest for treason, murder, conspiracy, and crimes against the people of the Colorado Territory. Bradford's voice carried the full authority of territorial law. Captain Morrison, please have your men secure the colonel and ensure he's properly restrained. No, Whitfield screamed, reaching for his sidearm. I won't be destroyed by savages and traitors. But Standing Wolf, despite his chains and the noose still around his neck, moved with the fluid grace of a trained warrior. He swept Whitfield's legs with his bound hands, sending the colonel crashing to the ground before the weapon could clear its holster. Captain Morrison's soldiers were on Whitfield immediately, restraining the former commanding officer as he continued to rave about conspiracy and betrayal. Remove that noose from Standing Wolf's neck, Governor Bradford commanded, and strike off his chains. This man is not only innocent, he's a victim of the real criminal we've just exposed. As the chains fell away from Standing Wolf's wrists and ankles, Caitlin felt tears of relief streaming down her face. The nightmare was over. Justice had prevailed, and an innocent man would live to see another sunset. Standing Wolf approached her slowly, his dark eyes warm with gratitude and something deeper. Sister who walks between worlds, he said softly, you have honored your childhood name. You have built a bridge between our peoples that cannot be destroyed by hatred or fear. Governor Bradford turned to address the gathered crowd. Let this day be remembered not for the execution that almost occurred, but for the justice that ultimately prevailed. Let it be known that the Colorado Territory will not tolerate corruption or murder, regardless of the uniform worn by those who commit such crimes. As Whitfield was led away in chains, screaming threats and accusations, Caitlin looked at Standing Wolf and saw not the condemned prisoner of that morning, but a man whose dignity and innocence had helped expose one of the most monstrous conspiracies in territorial history. What happens now, she asked. Standing Wolf smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. Now we rebuild the trust that men like Whitfield tried to destroy. Now we prove that peace is possible when truth guides our steps instead of lies. And as the sun rose fully over Fort Harrison, it illuminated not a gallows and a dead man, but a community beginning to heal from the wounds inflicted by those who would profit from permanent warfare. Justice had prevailed, but more than that, love and courage had triumphed over hatred and fear. 1 year later, the same courtyard at Fort Harrison bore witness to a very different kind of gathering. Where a gallows had once stood, now there were tables laden with food representing both frontier and Lakota traditions. The fort's first official peace treaty signing was drawing representatives from across the Colorado Territory. Caitlin Murphy Standing Wolf adjusted the beautiful beaded necklace her husband had given her on their wedding day, watching him work with Governor Bradford and other tribal leaders to establish the framework for lasting coexistence. The woman who had once been just a translator between languages had become a bridge between entire worlds. Standing Wolf's real name, she'd learned, was Joseph Crow Feather, and he'd been working as a secret negotiator for the U.S. government for 3 years, trying to prevent exactly the kind of bloodshed that Whitfield had been orchestrating. His capture had been part of a plan to expose corruption in the territorial military, though no one had anticipated how deep that corruption ran. Major Webb, fully recovered from his injuries and promoted to colonel for his role in exposing the conspiracy, approached with a warm smile. "Mrs. Standing Wolf, your husband is requesting your assistance with the final treaty language. Something about ensuring the English translation captures the proper spirit of the Lakota concepts." Caitlin laughed, still amazed at how naturally she'd grown into her role as both wife and diplomatic interpreter. "Tell him I'll be right there. Though I suspect he understands English better than most of the territorial officials at this point." The conspiracy Whitfield had led extended much further than anyone had initially realized. Congressional investigations had uncovered systematic corruption involving Indian agents, territorial administrators, and military contractors who had profited from perpetual conflict. The trials were still ongoing, but the evidence Caitlin and Webb had gathered that desperate dawn had proven decisive in securing convictions and reforming the entire system of Indian settler relations. Sergeant Collins, granted clemency in exchange for his testimony, now served as Webb's assistant in implementing the new policies of genuine cooperation rather than systematic exploitation. "You know what amazes me most?" Standing Wolf asked as Caitlin joined him at the treaty table. "A year ago, you risked your life to save a man you barely knew. Now you're helping reshape the future of two peoples." "I didn't save you," Caitlin corrected, taking his hand as they watched children from both communities playing together in the courtyard. "We saved each other. And we proved that truth is stronger than any lie, no matter how carefully constructed." Standing Wolf squeezed her hand gently. "Singing Bird sends her love, by the way. She says her son speaks of his Aunt Caitlin constantly and wants to know when you'll visit to teach him more English words." The mention of her childhood friend filled Caitlin with warmth. The bridge she'd built between worlds had allowed her to reconnect with relationships she'd thought lost forever, while building new ones she'd never dared to imagine. As the sun set over the Colorado Territory, painting the sky in the same golden hues that had witnessed both a near tragedy and ultimate triumph, Caitlin reflected on how much had changed. Where there had been hatred, now there was understanding. Where there had been systematic deception, now there was honest communication. Where there had been a corrupt colonel orchestrating genocide, now there were leaders from both peoples working together toward genuine peace. Sometimes, she realized, the most important thing you can do is refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable. Sometimes standing up for what's right, even when it seems impossible, can change the course of history. The woman who had walked between worlds had found her true home at last, not in any single culture, but in the bridges of understanding and love that connected all peoples who chose courage over fear, truth over convenient lies.